Vanakkam. I'm Vayoni Dimel. This is Boston Lanka News, bringing you news, views and entertainment from Boston and USA. Ranking member of U.S. House Foreign Affairs Subcommittee, Congressman Faleomavaega, on Tuesday, February 26th, expressed his deep concerns over the double standards applied in the U.S. foreign policy towards Sri Lanka. He made these comments at the committee hearing on the Rebalance to Asia Why South Asia Matters, where U.S. Assistant Secretary of State Robert O. Blake gave testimony.
Regarding Sri Lanka, Mr. Chairman, I agree with the Kerry Lugar congressional report, which declares we need to rechart U.S. strategy in Sri Lanka beyond humanitarian and political reforms. The U.S. simply cannot afford to lose Sri Lanka due to its strategic importance. Last week, I had the privilege of visiting Sri Lanka and met with President Rajapaksa for more than 2 hours. I also met with Governor of the Northern Province and personally visited Jaffna because I wanted to see for myself the post-conflict development since 2009, when Sri Lanka finally became the first country in the world to eradicate terrorism on its own soil by defeating the Tamil Tigers, which remains listed as the terrorist organization by 32 countries, including our own country, Mr. Chairman, India, Canada, and members of the European Union, and dubbed by the FBI as one of the most ruthless terrorist organizations in the world.
He called the U.S. government to acknowledge the positive developments in Sri Lanka and the challenging work undertaken by the Sri Lankan government.
After a 30-year terrorist conflict or war, the challenges Sri Lankan government faces are enormous, but the strides the government has made to rebuild in a way that establishes lasting peace and equality for all citizens should be firmly acknowledged.
In his opening remarks, Ranking Member Congressman Faleomavaega, who is a Democratic Party congressional representative from American Samoa, made very clear about his views on how U.S. foreign policy towards Sri Lanka has to be implemented.
Regrettably, in the resolution it intends to submit again to the United Nations Human Rights Council, the U.S. fails to mention one, not even one positive development for Sri Lanka. Such failure suggests that the United States is not being even-handed when it comes to dealing with sensitive human rights issues across the globe. And I am, Mr. Chairman, deeply concerned that our inconsistent policies, which lead to a loss of credibility for the United States, which will negatively impact our relations in the Asia-Pacific region for years to come. So I call upon my government, the United States of America, to find a better way forward rather than using United Nations resolutions to destabilize developing nations like Sri Lanka while ignoring human rights abuses in nations like Indonesia, where our geopolitical and strategic and military interests supersede our human rights agenda. The U.S.-led United Nations resolution should also be withdrawn for focusing only on the last few months of the war and failing to acknowledge that for almost 30 years, Mr. Chairman, the Tamil Tigers hacked to death innocent women, men, women, and children in Sri Lanka, carried out some 378 suicide attacks, more than any other terrorist organization in the world.
Addressing the Assistant Secretary Blake, the chair of the House Foreign Affairs Subcommittee on the Asia and Pacific, Republican Party Congressman Steve Chabot shared his concerns about Sri Lanka.
Sri Lanka, which can be a quite controversial issue, and there are two sides to a lot of the things that are said about this. And I've had many contacts with the government and also with the Tamils, and they, shall we say, they differ in a number of areas. And I would say that the attempts at reconciliation between the government and the Tamil people have been disappointing in many respects. Sri Lankan leaders, for example, are talking about repealing the 13th Amendment, which guarantees certain basic rights to provincial councils. And U.S. policy towards Sri Lanka has so far apparently not worked out, been able to convince the government to keep its basic agreements to bring reconciliation and political settlement to fruition. What steps has and can the administration make to urge the government to move towards a more genuine reconciliation with the Tamil community? And
Assistant Secretary Blake, who is very familiar about Sri Lanka, responded to Congressman Shabbat.
Well, let me try to answer your question and also the ranking member's question simultaneously, because he talked about that in his statement. And let me just say with a little bit of background that, you know, obviously I've been working on Sri Lanka now for 6 years and know the country extremely well. I consider myself a friend of the country and a supporter of the country. And at the end of the conflict, as you know, there were many questions about the number of civilians that were killed at the very end of the conflict. An independent UN panel estimated that between 10,000 and 40,000 innocent civilians may have been killed. Nonetheless, the United States decided that it would support a domestic, that is a Sri Lankan domestic process to try to get to the bottom of that and to investigate that and to develop what has now been called the Lessons Learned and Reconciliation Commission process. But we did so with the understanding, Mr. Chairman, that there would be rapid progress towards reconciliation and accountability. And I must say, progress thus far on implementing the LLRC action plan has been slow, and we've been disappointed, as you say, that the government has not proceeded so far with elections for the Northern Provincial Council 4 years after the end of the war. We've been disappointed that there hasn't been a conclusion of the dialogue between the Tamil National Alliance, this umbrella group for the Tamil groups, as well as for the TNA dialogue with the government on devolution. And we've been disappointed that there have been some backward movement on democracy, as you say, things like the 13th Amendment, but also the recent impeachment of Sri Lanka's Chief Justice. So for that reason, last year we supported a resolution in the UN Human Rights Council to put additional pressure on Sri Lanka to implement its own Lessons Learned and Reconciliation report. We did so with the support of countries like India that voted yes, and a large majority of other countries in the Human Rights Council. I think there's good support thus far to have another vote this year to continue to urge Sri Lanka to implement its own report, and that's why we're pursuing that again this year.
Thank you.
Following up with his opening remarks, Ranking Member Faleomavaega outlined in detail the way he saw powerful United States trying to bully small island nation of Sri Lanka.
I had mentioned in my statement about the double standard that we're applying as far as violation of human rights. And the sense that I have is, why is the most powerful country in the world picking on a small little country like Sri Lanka, the size of West Virginia, 60,000 square miles with only 3 million people, and yet in Sri Lanka we're talking about 21 million people living there. The serious question I have is that for 27 or 29 years, this country was in a state of civil war. It's not a conflict. It's not a question of the Tamil people asking for more autonomy. And we have to understand not all Tamils are members of this terrorist organization called the LTTE, or Tamil Tigers, that our government, along with 32 other countries, also categorized as a terrorist organization. And in the process, you're talking about 27 years for some 80 to 100,000 Sri Lankans ended up dead. A lot of innocent men, women, and children. And what I'm trying to seek here is that there also was a country that had a civil war. It was the United States of America. For 4 years, we ended up with 600,000 of our soldiers died from that terrible conflict. And it wasn't a question of the southern states asking for autonomy. They wanted to secede and pull away from the mother country, just like the Tamil Tigers wanted to do in their efforts in seeking this war against the Tamil government. My concern here is that we are looking at such a small little sequence of this 2 or 3 months that now we're questioning, and the reason why we have this resolution before the United Nations Human Rights Council, but forgetting the fact that for 29 years, the Sri Lankan government has had to deal with this terrorist organization that I just could not believe the atrocities that were committed by these people. And now overnight we just think, oh, we've got to hit this resolution against them. This is where my concern with double standard. Our government, for the 10-year period that we were in war in Vietnam, Mr. Secretary, let's ask the tens of thousands of women and children, innocent civilians, that were exposed to Agent Orange when we were there for the 10-year period. Let's ask the people in Laos and Cambodia for the 6 million pounds of cluster bombs that we dropped there. These countries never declared war on us. Where is the consistency in our standards as far as human rights are concerned? That we're pointing the finger at this little country, Sri Lanka, and to think that perhaps that maybe we need to clean up our own backyard and suggest that maybe we be a little more consistent. If we're going to do it against Sri Lanka, let's make sure that we're clean ourselves. So I just wanted your comment on that. I've got only 1 minute left on this.
Well, thank you, Mr. Ranking Member. Let me just say, with respect to the LTT, we fully agree. The United States was one of the very first countries to declare the LTT a foreign terrorist organization, and we have a long line of public statements and other condemnations that we issued for the terrible acts of terrorism that they were responsible for. We also took concrete action to help the Sri Lankans. We gave them radar systems so that they would be able to detect LTT.
In fact, we helped the Sri Lankan government fight against the Navy that even the Tamil Tigers had.
So we, we certainly took a very uncompromising view with respect to the LTT. But again, at the very end of the war, the question is, what happened to those 10 to 40,000 civilians who were killed? And I think everybody in Sri Lanka believes that there needs to be closure on that question. And closure needs to be achieved through this Lessons Learned and Reconciliation Commission process. It's a domestic process, so it should have the support of the government, and we hope that that will continue, and that's the purpose of this resolution. But there needs to be justice, Mr. Chairman, for there to be closure, and there needs to be reconciliation between these communities. So that's what we're trying to achieve. And
I know I've only got 10 more seconds, Mr. Secretary. I just want to say that that was part of the subject that I discussed this personally with the President of Sri Lanka, and he is concerned. In fact, he's spending more time up there in the northern province and all the amount of resources they're trying to do to make this as part of the reconciliation process. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
That concludes our news edition. We meet you again with another news edition of News, Views and Entertainment from Boston and USA. Till then, goodbye.